The Texas sun was merciless that morning, beating down on Caleb Whitmore's ranch like a hammer on an anvil. At 34, Bear had seen his fair share of hard days, but something about this one felt different. As he mended a broken fence post near the creek movement in the distance, caught his eye a small figure stumbling toward his water source. It was a child no older than 8 or 9, her steps weaving in unsteady zigzags. Even from far off, Bear could see her clothes were torn traditional Comanche garments faded from sun and wear. Most ranchers in this part of Texas would have reached for their rifle first and asked questions later. After all, tensions between settlers and the Comanche had simmered for years, often boiling over into raids and bloodshed. But Bear wasn't like most men. Setting his tools aside, he approached slowly, keeping his hands visible, every movement deliberate. As he neared, he saw the child more clearly. Her dark eyes were too big for her gaunt face, and her cracked lips spoke of days without water. She looked up at him, fear and desperation mingling in her gaze, and spoke in rapid Comanche. Bear couldn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. Her small hands gestured toward her mouth, then the creek, a universal plea for food and water. Bear hesitated. He thought about his neighbors, about the gossip and suspicion that would surely follow if they saw him helping a Comanche child. He thought about the warnings in town of increasing tensions with the tribes. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to turn his back. But then he looked into her eyes again, eyes that mirrored the same hollow grief he carried inside since losing his wife and son to cholera 3 years earlier, and he made his choice. Without a word, Bear scooped her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her small body trembling from fear, hunger, or both. Inside his modest cabin, he laid her gently on his only chair and went to work. A pot of leftover stew simmered on the stove and fresh bread cooled on the counter. The aroma seemed to stir something in the girl, and for the first time Bear thought he saw a flicker of hope in her exhausted eyes. As he ladled stew into a bowl, his gaze caught on something around her neck, a necklace of intricate beadwork, unmistakable in its pattern. His heart froze. Only last week, old Pete Morrison had described those beads to him, the sacred adornment worn by the family of Iron Wolf, the most feared Comanche leader in the territory. If this girl was who he thought she was, Bear wasn't just helping a hungry child. He was harboring the daughter of a man who could bring 200 warriors down on his ranch without a moment's hesitation. And 20 miles away, that's exactly what was happening. Iron Wolf had found his daughter's trail, and his war party was riding hard, driven by fury and grief. As the Texas sun dipped low behind the horizon, long shadows stretched across Bear's modest ranch. Inside the cabin, the little Comanche girl slept soundly in his chair, wrapped in his only wool blanket. Her breathing was shallow but steady now, the stew and bread giving her frail body the strength it so desperately needed. Bear sat at the table, staring into the flame of a kerosene lantern, his mind a storm of worry. It wasn't just that he had helped a native child. It was this child, the daughter of Iron Wolf, a man whose name was whispered in every saloon and church pew from Amarillo to Abilene. White Bull wasn't just a leader. He was a force of nature, a warrior who had united tribes and crushed cavalry patrols without mercy. Bear had no illusions about what would happen if the chief thought his daughter had been harmed or kidnapped. The sound of distant hoofbeats pulled Bear from his thoughts. At first he thought it was his mind playing tricks. Then the sound grew louder, a steady drumbeat against the hard Texas earth. Bear's stomach turned to lead. He rose and peered through the window, catching sight of 3 riders barreling down the dirt road. It was his neighbor Cletus Hartwell and 2 other men from town, Deputy Marshal Eli Cart and Reverend Samuel Pike. Bear stepped outside before they could dismount, hoping to keep their voices down and avoid waking the girl. But Cletus was already shouting, his voice carrying urgency and fear. "Bear, you damn fool. What in God's name are you thinking?" Cletus barked as his horse came to a sliding halt. Jake Morrison's face was pale as he added, "Smoke signals went up from the hills this afternoon. The Comanche are looking for someone. Word is, White Bull's daughter's been missing since the storm 3 nights ago. Bear, you wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Bear swallowed hard. He thought about lying about sending them away and figuring it out alone. But he couldn't. These men were his neighbors, flawed though they were. "She's inside," he said quietly. "Half-starved and exhausted. I couldn't leave her to die." A heavy silence fell. Reverend Samuel Pike shook his head, his voice low. "Son, do you have any idea what you've done? You're holding the chief's blood. He's not going to ask questions. He's going to come down on you like the wrath of the Almighty. They're going to think you took her," Cletus added. "Hell, they probably already do. White Bull's been known to wipe out entire settlements for less than this." Jake Morrison mounted his horse again. "I've got to report this, Bear. It's my duty, but I'll give you a head start. Get her back to her people before they find you here. If you're still standing here when they come, God help you." Bear's voice caught. In the dark, she can barely walk. "How the hell am I supposed to approach a Comanche camp without getting shot full of arrows?" "That's your problem now," Jake said grimly. I'm riding to town to warn everyone else. If White Bull decides to make an example of you, he might not stop at just your ranch." As the three men rode off into the darkness, Bear stood frozen on his porch, listening to the faint sound of their hoofbeats fade into the night. Inside, the girl stirred slightly, her small body shifting under the blanket. And then he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. The steady rhythmic pounding of war drums carried on the evening breeze. Faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. Bear's chest tightened as he realized what it meant. They weren't waiting for morning. The Comanche were coming tonight. He bolted inside and barred the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The girl sat up wide-eyed. The drums had woken her too. She spoke rapidly in Comanche, pointing to the door and then at herself, her hands trembling. Even without understanding the words, Bear felt the panic in her gestures. He knelt beside her. "I know you can't understand me, little one, but I'm trying to help you. Those drums, that's your people coming, isn't it?" The girl nodded, tears pooling in her dark eyes. Then she grabbed his sleeve and pulled him toward the window. She raised her hands and began opening and closing her fingers repeatedly. Bear counted. 10, 20, 30, till she stopped at 200. 200 warriors. Bear felt his knees weaken. He'd hoped for maybe a dozen angry braves he could talk to. But 200, that was enough to wipe every ranch in the county off the map. Outside, the drums stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound. Bear peeked out the window. At first there was nothing. Then, like shadows melting from the prairie grass, the shapes of mounted warriors began to emerge in the moonlight. They came in perfect formation, a wide semicircle tightening around his cabin. War paint gleamed on their faces. Feathers swayed in the night breeze. Every rider held a weapon at the ready. These weren't men who had come to negotiate, and in that moment Bear knew he was standing on the razor's edge between life and death. The air was so still it felt like the whole prairie was holding its breath. 200 Comanche warriors sat motionless on their horses, a wide circle of war paint feathers and cold, sharp eyes surrounding Bear's modest cabin. Every weapon was pointed in his direction. At the center of the formation, astride a massive chestnut stallion, sat the man himself, Iron Wolf. His presence was almost otherworldly. He was broad-shouldered and tall, even from a distance, his long black hair streaked with silver. His bare chest marked by scars from battles won and enemies defeated. His eyes burned with the kind of rage and grief that could set fire to the plains. Bear felt his mouth go dry as he glanced down at the little girl beside him. Her tiny hand clutched his sleeve with surprising strength, and her dark eyes pleaded with him. She shook her head frantically and pointed to herself, then made a gesture across her throat. Bear didn't speak her language, but the meaning was clear enough. Whatever happened next, his life was hanging by a thread. Then a voice called out from the darkness. It was deep and commanding, the English heavily accented but perfectly clear. "White man," it said, "we know you have taken what belongs to us. Send out the girl and perhaps you will live to see morning." The voice carried such authority that Bear felt it vibrate in his bones. There was no doubt. This was Iron Wolf himself. Bear's heart pounded as he glanced down at the girl again. He'd never been so terrified in his life, not even when cholera had taken his wife and son years earlier. Back then he'd felt helpless, but this was different. Here there was still a chance, however small, that he could change what was about to happen. Taking a deep breath, Bear made the hardest decision of his life. He opened the cabin door and stepped outside with his hands raised high, palms open, to show he carried no weapon. The girl followed close behind him, her small body trembling, but her chin held high. The sight that met them was like something from a nightmare. The warriors' faces were expressionless, but the tension in the air was as sharp as a drawn knife. Bear knew one wrong move could bring 200 arrows flying his way. White Bull dismounted, landing with a heavy thud that sent a shiver down Bear's spine. He strode forward with slow, deliberate steps until he stood just outside arm's reach. The warriors behind him shifted slightly, the sound of their weapons creaking like a warning growl. "My daughter tells me you fed her," White Bull said coldly. "She says you gave her shelter." Bear's voice was steady, though his legs felt like they might buckle. "Yes, she was starving. I couldn't let a child die." The chief studied him for what felt like an eternity. Then his eyes narrowed. "She also says you saw the sacred beads of our family around her neck. You knew who she was, yet you did not return her to us." Bear's stomach dropped. He'd hoped the girl's testimony would help, but it seemed to be working against him. I was going to bring her back in the morning," Bear stammered. "She was too weak to travel at night." "Perhaps," White Bull said, his voice low and dangerous. "Or perhaps you thought to keep her as a prize, to trade her back to us for cattle or horses or safe passage through our lands." The accusation hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and dark. Bear could feel 200 pairs of eyes on him, warriors waiting for their chief's signal to turn this standoff into a massacre. "That's not true," Bear said firmly. "I never wanted anything from you. I just couldn't watch a child suffer, but he could see the doubt in White Bull's face, and worse in the faces of the younger warriors shifting restlessly on their horses. They were eager for blood. The girl tugged on her father's sleeve, speaking rapidly in Comanche. Her voice was small but fierce, rising and falling like the wind through prairie grass. White Bull listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he looked at Bear again. "She says you could have driven her away," he translated. "You could have left her to die. Instead, you carried her to your home, gave her your food, your blanket. You asked for nothing in return." Bear nodded. "That's the truth. I've got no quarrel with your people, Chief. I just work my land and try to live in peace." White Bull's face softened just barely, but the murmurs from the warriors behind him grew louder, and Bear caught a single word repeated in their language, Wasatchu. "White man." Not a friendly term. One of the warriors, a younger man with a scar running down his cheek, rode forward. His spear pointed directly at Bear. He spoke rapidly, his voice sharp with anger. White Bull's jaw tightened. "He says that any white man who touches a Comanche child for any reason must pay the price," White Bull translated grimly. The tension in the air crackled like lightning. Bear's breath came shallow and fast. If he had to die, he would go down standing his ground. Then, without warning, the little girl stepped forward. She put herself between Bear and her father's warriors, her small frame dwarfed by the men around her. Her voice rang out clear and strong as she spoke in Comanche, her words fast and passionate. The warriors quieted. Even the angry young man lowered his spear slightly, his face shifting from rage to confusion. White Bull listened intently, then spoke softly. "She is telling them about how she got lost in the storm, how she wandered for days without food or water, how she expected to die alone on the prairie until you found her." The girl turned to face the crowd of warriors, her arms outstretched as she continued speaking. Her voice grew louder, more forceful, and Bear watched as the hardened faces of battle-worn men began to soften. "She says if we punish kindness, we become the monsters the white man believes us to be," White Bull said. Silence fell over the camp. Even the horses seemed to hold still. Finally, the scarred warrior spoke again, his voice lower now. White Bull nodded as he translated. "He says perhaps the spirits sent his brother a teacher instead of an enemy, that maybe wisdom sometimes comes from the smallest voices." Bear's shoulders sagged in relief, but White Bull raised a hand. "Do not thank me yet. My warriors came for justice. They cannot return with empty hands. If they do, I will lose their trust." Bear swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" "There is only one way to satisfy both justice and honor tonight," White Bull said gravely. "But it will require something from you that may be harder than dying." The ride to the Comanche village was long and silent, lit only by the cold glow of the moon. Caleb Whitmore followed closely behind Iron Wolf, surrounded on all sides by warriors. Their eyes never left him, and though no one raised a weapon, the tension was as thick as the night air. The little girl sat astride her father's horse, clutching his waist tightly. From time to time, she looked back at Bear, her dark eyes filled with something he couldn't quite read, worry, hope, or maybe both. They crossed rugged canyons and narrow paths Bear had never seen before, hidden places only known to those born on this land. As they rode, Bear's thoughts churned. He had no idea what awaited him in the heart of the Comanche camp. Would they listen? Or would this be the place where he met his end? When they finally crested a ridge, the sight below stole Bear's breath. Dozens of fires flickered like stars in the darkness, casting an orange glow over a circle of teepees. Figures moved about like shadows, men sharpening spears, women tending fires, and children peeking out from behind their mothers' skirts. White Bull raised a hand and the war party slowed. Bear's horse was led forward until he found himself in the center of the camp, dismounting under the watchful gaze of hundreds of Comanche eyes. 7 elders sat in a semicircle around a roaring fire, their faces weathered and stern. Their braided hair was streaked with gray and white, and the feathers adorning their cloaks stirred gently in the night breeze. Bear felt their stares like arrows piercing his skin. White Bull addressed them in Comanche, his deep voice carrying authority. Though Bear didn't understand the words, he could feel the weight of the moment. The girl remained close to her father, her small hand gripping his. After White Bull finished speaking, one of the elders rose slowly to his feet. He was ancient, his back stooped, but his presence filled the circle. He spoke softly, and White Bull translated. "They have heard the story of what you have done. Some believe you are a man of honor. Others believe you are a deceiver who lured the chief's daughter for your own gain. Tonight we will decide which is true." Bear's throat was dry, but he met the elder's gaze without flinching. "I didn't lure her," he said firmly. "She was starving and alone. I gave her food and shelter because it was the right thing to do. I asked nothing in return." The elder listened, his expression unreadable. Then Broken Arrow, the young warrior who had earlier demanded blood, stepped into the circle. His face was twisted with rage. He spoke harshly, pointing his spear toward Bear. White Bull translated grimly. He says that no white man can be trusted. He says you must pay with your life for even touching a child of this tribe. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several warriors nodded in agreement, their hands tightening around weapons. Bear felt his pulse hammering in his ears. Then the little girl stepped forward. Her voice was small at first, but it grew stronger as she spoke. She pointed to Bear, then to herself, then mimed eating and sleeping. Her words poured out like a river breaking through a dam. White Bull's voice softened as he translated. She tells them how she got lost in the storm, how she wandered for days without food or water, how she thought she would die until this man found her. The girl turned to Broken Arrow, her eyes blazing. She spoke with such passion that even the young warrior hesitated. She asks him if he has children, White Bull continued. She asks what he would want a stranger to do if his child was starving and alone on the prairie. A hush fell over the crowd. Broken Arrow's fierce expression wavered. He lowered his spear slightly, but his jaw remained tight. The girl kept speaking. White Bull's voice grew more solemn as he translated. She says that if we punish kindness, we become no better than the soldiers who kill without asking questions first. She says mercy is not weakness. Mercy is strength. The oldest elder rose again. His eyes were like coals in the firelight as he surveyed the crowd. Then he turned to Bear. Do you swear, he asked through White Bull's translation, that if any of our people come to you in need, hungry, wounded, or lost, you will show them the same kindness you showed this child? Bear didn't hesitate. I swear it, he said, his voice steady. I don't want war with your people. I want peace. The elder nodded slowly, then turned to the gathered warriors. He spoke in Comanche, his voice carrying the weight of decades. When he finished, White Bull translated. The council has decided you will not die tonight. The spirits sent us a test and you have passed it. You are free to return to your land. More than that, you are under the protection of this tribe. Any Comanche who harms you or your property will answer to us. Relief washed over Bear like rain on parched soil. He barely noticed the little girl running to him, wrapping her small arms around his waist. In halting English, she whispered, "Thank you for saving me. Now I save you." As dawn broke over the prairie, Bear rode back to his ranch, not as a condemned man, but as a bridge between two worlds. As the first rays of sunlight broke across the Texas plains, Caleb Whitmore rode back to his ranch, not as a dead man walking, but as someone reborn. The night had been long, filled with tension so thick it felt like the prairie air itself might ignite, and yet against all odds he had survived. More than that, he had earned the respect of a people who had every reason to see him as their enemy. Behind him rode an escort of honor Comanche warriors flanking him on both sides. Their war paint, once terrifying in the moonlight, now glistened like ceremonial markings in the gentle dawn. Among them was Iron Wolf, whose piercing eyes no longer burned with rage but held a guarded respect. The chief's daughter rode beside her father, her small frame straight and proud, no longer the starving child Bear had first found stumbling across his land. When they reached Bear's cabin, White Bull dismounted and stepped forward. He looked out over the wide stretch of prairie, then back at Bear. My people and your people have spilled much blood on this land, the chief said gravely. But last night you showed us something rare. You showed us mercy when fear would have made most men reach for their rifles. Because of that, there will be no more blood here. Bear nodded, still struggling to find words. I didn't do it for recognition, Chief. I saw a child in need. That's all. White Bull's expression softened and he gestured toward the girl. She will not forget you, nor will I. From this day forward, your ranch will be a place of peace. Any Comanche who harms you or your property will answer to me. But in return, you must keep your promise. If any of my people come to you in need, hungry, wounded, or lost, you will help them as you helped her. I'll honor that, Bear said without hesitation, as long as I draw breath. With that, White Bull extended his hand and Bear clasped it firmly. It was a simple gesture, but one that felt monumental. Two men from opposing worlds forging an understanding where none had existed before. The warriors turned their horses and rode off into the morning haze, their silhouettes fading like spirits into the rising sun. Bear stood there for a long moment, the chief's daughter waving softly before disappearing from view. In the months that followed, word spread across the Texas frontier. Neighbors who had once whispered about Bear being too soft for this hard land now spoke of him in hushed, almost reverent tones. His cabin became a place where two worlds cautiously met. One evening, an older Comanche woman arrived at Bear's door, her arm badly wounded from a fall. Without hesitation, Bear cleaned and dressed her injury, offering her bread and coffee before sending her safely on her way. Days later, her sons brought him fresh venison in thanks, laying it quietly on his porch. A few weeks after that, a settler's wagon broke an axle near Bear's land. The man, bitter and distrustful of native people, was shocked to see a small group of Comanche braves helping him lift the wagon from the mud. When he asked why, the eldest among them simply said, "This is Bear's land. Here we do not fight." For the first time in years, there was a fragile peace in the region, one held together not by treaties or soldiers, but by a rancher's simple act of compassion and the courage of a little girl who had spoken truth to power. Years passed, and the girl grew into a young woman, a respected member of her tribe. She learned English and became a translator and mediator between the Comanche and settlers. Every year on the anniversary of that fateful night, she rode to Bear's ranch to share a meal. They would sit on the porch looking out over the plains, talking softly about life loss and the strange paths that had brought them together. Bear never grew rich. He never became famous. But he lived a life of quiet dignity, respected by both whites and natives alike. He grew old on that ranch, the prairie winds etching deeper lines into his weathered face. When Bear passed away at the age of 73, he was not alone. At his funeral, Comanche warriors stood side by side with settlers, their heads bowed in silent tribute. The chief's daughter, now a woman with children of her own, placed a bundle of wildflowers and sacred beads on his grave. "You saved me when I had nothing," she whispered. "You taught us all what mercy means. Sleep well, Bear." In the years that followed, Bear's ranch became a symbol, a place where enemies once stood at the edge of war but chose understanding instead. And on the Texas wind, stories of his courage and kindness carried far and wide, reminding anyone who listened that sometimes the smallest acts of mercy can prevent the greatest tragedies. Years rolled by on the open Texas prairie, and Caleb Whitmore grew older with each passing season. The ranch that had once felt like a lonely outpost now thrived as a quiet sanctuary. It was no longer just a place where cattle grazed and fences needed mending. It had become something far more important, a bridge between two worlds that had once seemed destined to destroy each other. Every year on the anniversary of the night, 200 Comanche warriors had surrounded his cabin. Bear would sit on the front porch gazing out across the rolling grasslands. Without fail, she would come no longer the starving child he had carried in his arms, but a strong, graceful woman, her braids adorned with sacred beads. She had grown into a respected peacekeeper, fluent in both Comanche and English, working tirelessly to mediate disputes between settlers and her people. But when she visited Bear, she was just Nayeli again, the girl he had saved all those years ago. They would share a simple meal of bread and venison stew, talking about how far they'd come and how close they had come to losing it all that night. "I still remember your face," Nayeli said once, her voice soft like the evening breeze. "You look like a man carrying the whole weight of the prairie on your shoulders. But you didn't turn me away." Bear chuckled, his voice roughened by age but warm with affection. "I reckon I just saw a little girl who needed help. Didn't think much about anything else at the time." But in truth, he had thought plenty. Back then, fear had clawed at his chest. Fear of the Comanche, fear of his neighbor's judgment, fear of losing his own life. And yet that one small act of mercy, offering food and shelter to a starving child, had rippled outward in ways he never could have imagined. In the years that followed, Bear's ranch became known as neutral ground. Comanche warriors and white settlers alike would come sometimes in secret to speak, to trade, to find common ground. Hatred didn't vanish overnight, but in that little pocket of Texas, it no longer ruled every heart. When Bear passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, both Comanche and settlers gathered at his gravesite. Nayeli placed a bundle of wildflowers and a single white feather on the mound of earth. "He fed me when I had nothing," she told those gathered, her voice steady. "And he taught us all that kindness is stronger than fear." The wind sighed through the prairie grass, carrying her words far beyond the little ranch. And for years to come, they said that when the evening sun dipped low on the horizon, you could almost hear Bear's voice on the breeze, whispering a simple truth: sometimes saving a child saves the whole world. As we grow older, we come to understand that the smallest decisions can leave the deepest marks on the world around us. Caleb Whitmore's story reminds us of this timeless truth. When faced with a starving child from a people his neighbors considered enemies, Bear chose compassion over fear. It wasn't the safe choice. It wasn't the easy choice. But it was the right one, and it changed everything. For those of us who have lived through decades of change, conflict, and reconciliation in America, Bear's quiet courage strikes a chord. It speaks to a lesson we've learned the hard way: kindness carries more power than violence ever will. We've seen how fear divides communities, how anger burns bridges, but mercy, simple, honest mercy, can mend wounds and build trust where none seemed possible. In these later years of life, perhaps this lesson resonates even more deeply. We know the weight of regret, the cost of missed opportunities to do good. Bear's story reminds us it's never too late to act with grace, even when the world tells us to harden our hearts. If we can choose understanding over judgment, if we can extend a hand instead of pointing a finger, we leave behind a legacy far greater than wealth or fame. We leave behind proof that courage isn't always about standing your ground. It's about knowing when to bend, when to give, and when to love.